She was born in a family that was poor. She was thankful, never asked for more. And the young man who came her way.
Le Ferriere, a swampy area about an hour southwest of Rome, near the Mediterranean Sea in an area of Anzio, Nettuno, Italy. It is July 6th, 1902, in a little Italian farmhouse. On a hot summer day, a drama unfolds. A young man of 19 holds a knife over the frightened Marietta Goretti, only 11. Alessandro says to Maria, "Give in or I will kill you." For refusing sex, she is stabbed 14 times. Before her death, Marietta forgave her killer, Alessandro. He was sent to jail, but in 1929 he got out of prison on an amnesty. Then in 1934, Alessandro met Maria's mother, Assunta Goretti. He made a public confession. And then Alessandro and Assunta went to Mass together on Christmas Eve. Later, Alessandro lived in a Capuchin monastery as a third-order Franciscan. And while dying, he cried out, "Marietta," and then he expired. Maria's story lives on and has affected many lives. She put God first. She saw that beauty and love is chaste and forgiving.
She forgave him before she died. She was so young, not more than a child. The young man went to prison without any shame, till in a dream he heard her calling out his name. O Virgin and martyr, the Lord's beloved daughter, she was born to be the rose of Coronado. The battle's over, the victory's won. She will be forever young. She will always be the rose of Coronado.
Greetings, good people, and a warm welcome to Friends of St. Maria Goretti. And I'm your host, Tom O'Connor. And the name of the program this evening is Choose Life. And our very special guest today is Monsignor William Smith. And he is the professor of moral theology at Dunwoody. And that's in New York, Yonkers, New York. Thank you for being our guest today, Monsignor.
Thank you.
And we're talking about Choose Life. It's an electrifying title because the concept in the urgency in the federal courts today is going to revolutionize the way the Americans think, if it's effective. Can you talk about the federal courts, the Ninth Circuit and Second Circuit,
Sure.
and what's currently happening?
The Choose Life comes from the book of Deuteronomy, where the injunction to Moses just before he died was, if you choose life, you and your descendants will live. If you choose death, you create problems. Most people have been looking at the early end of life in our country for the last 15 to 20 years, usually the unborn who are at some risk, but almost out of nowhere, within 2 months, 2 federal circuit courts of appeals, the Ninth Circuit, which is California and 7 other states, on the 6th of March, and here in the Second Circuit, New York, and a couple of nearby states, those 2 federal appeal courts both legalized assisted suicide. So that means that all the states that have laws against assisting a suicide are really on hold. Those laws are on hold. The first one that was overturned was the state of Washington. That law was 140 years old, and the people in a referendum voted for it again in 1991. But one federal judge overturned that law, and then on appeal. So these 2 appeals will undoubtedly next year end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And then we're going to have, if we're going to have designer jeans and designer bathrooms, you're going to have designer death, because basically this is the sidecar of euthanasia. The presenting reason is that it'll all be done kind of clean medically. But it will also be a disaster for the medical profession when you're not able to tell whether this doctor is here to help you or get rid of you, because it would legalize killing. And most states have no law against suicide, okay? Or if they do, there's no penalty.
When you say no law, that means?
There is no, it's either, it's a moot case. Either is no law against suicide, or if there is, there's no penalty. Now, obviously, if someone attempts suicide and succeeds, that's what the lawyers say is moot. But if someone attempts suicide and they fail, they don't belong in jail. They need counseling, they need a cup of coffee, they need to see a light at the end of the tunnel. But 2/3 of our states do have laws against assisting a suicide. For instance, in New York, that's part of the homicide statute. It's a felony, it's a crime. And that's what has been upset by these 2 federal courts. And it's something that I think most people, they may have heard the headline that night on the nightly news, but apart from that, most folks don't know that this is going on. It's obviously something we didn't vote for, but its implications both for society, for the elderly sick, for those who can't speak up for themselves, and for the medical profession. This is a very gigantic step in the wrong direction.
The American public knows of Dr. Kevorkian.
Oh, Kevorkian.
Right, Dr. Death.
Dr. Jack Kevorkian.
And it was interesting because you were telling me prior to the program that his way of life was not really as a doctor of the living.
Well, he was a pathologist, so he was always a coroner all his life. He always dealt with corpses. And in fact, he lost his license in the state of California. But the reason he went to Michigan was because Michigan is one of the few states that doesn't have a law against assisting a suicide. And they've had a couple of court cases, and they tried to pass the law, and it got all kind of complicated. But he has just kind of declared himself the advocate of this cause. If you talk to serious doctors, they're troubled by him. When you meet a patient who you've never met before, you don't know their prior history, you don't know whether they're mentally disturbed or they're just clinically depressed. And then his class act is carbon monoxide in a VW van. Now, if anyone thinks that carbon monoxide is medicine, I don't think you have to go to medical school to figure out carbon monoxide has no therapeutic benefits. And there's nothing really classy about gassing someone in the back of a VW van, but that's what he's been doing and getting away with.
Is it good theater?
Makes
Or
headlines.
bad theater?
Makes headlines. Time magazine 2 years ago, he made the cover, which to some extent legitimizes. I mean, there are hard cases. There are things that we should talk about. More improvements have to be in pain relief, palliative care, and those things. But killing a patient is just, I mean, and now it's already happened in the Netherlands. The Netherlands changed their law about 5 years ago. So they call it mercy killing. And things are so bad now in the Netherlands that some of the older folks in the south of Holland won't go to the hospital for any reason whatsoever.
They'd rather die at home.
But they're afraid. No, they cross the border and go to Belgium.
Oh, is that right?
Because they're not sure. I mean, once you legalize this, and you know, they say 1 out of every 4 North Americans is going to have a real brush with depression once in their life. And last year they had a 42-year-old woman who was suffering no terminal illness. She was depressed. She asked the doctor for assistance in taking her life, and some Dutch doctor cooperated. She's dead. Depression is treatable. It's not a terminal disease.
It's temporary.
Yeah, in most cases. Now, some cases are harder than others, but with some drugs and the investment of caring services, a lot of progress can be made. But and that's in a country much smaller than ours, where the doctors do know the patients and the patients know the doctors. If you multiply that by about 150, then you'd have a scenario of what could happen in the United States. And this is not... the Holy Father put out an encyclical on life about a year ago called Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life. And in it, he portrayed what he called a culture of death. More depression, more emphasis on killing than on helping or curing or caring. And even people who don't like the Pope or they don't like the teaching of the Catholic Church, I have seen no one criticize his description of how some Western countries, including ours, is edging into this culture of death. That, I mean, Christians, Judeo-Christians, see life as a gift. You don't own your life the way you own a big pen. You can throw it away. You can throw away your shoes when they're worn out. But you really don't own your life the way you own a thing. But a lot of people, I think, look at it that way.
It's their own personal property.
It's my thing, so I can do what I want with what's mine. You know, I want to fold the cards, I'll fold the cards. It goes back to C.S. Lewis's old question, are you the landlord or the tenant of your existence? If you're the landlord, you own the place. But if you're a tenant, you don't. You can't blow up the building. And that basic respect for life is, now as our society gets grayer, I say that to you looking at the top of your head,
Thanks.
but we're all getting a little bit older, and the Pope describes a profound shift, a shift away from a standard of individual dignity, where generosity and respect are really required, to one of usefulness and functionality. And a lot of people think that instead of paying attention to who you are, the emphasis on what do you have and what do you make. And if you don't have anything and you don't make anything, someone might be interested in removing you from the scene, or at least convincing you to do it to yourself first.
Prior to your dialogue before this show, you were telling me that the obvious doctor was Dr. Kevorkian.
Kevorkian,
But
right.
there is a mysterious doctor that is going to be revealed on this program who is really behind the scenes. He's not well known. I have never heard of him. And we'd like a little expose of this doctor so that whatever he's proposing to do in New York State becomes public knowledge tonight.
That's Dr. Quill, Timothy Quill. Timothy Quill has some prestige. He's a physician up at the University of Rochester. He's written a number of articles in favor of euthanasia in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the Bible of the medical profession. That's the most prestigious medical publication in the whole world. Also in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And the court case that started the challenge of our law, that court case is Quill versus Vacco. Vacco is our state attorney general, and it was Dr. Quill who, now I grant you the headlines kind of go to Dr. Kevorkian, but if you talk to most physicians, they think Kevorkian's a jerk. No one says Quill is a jerk. He writes, whether he writes his own stuff, I do not know, but beautifully written articles, very expressive of compassion, but it's the exact same agenda as Kevorkian. He happens to be a classy type rather than a crude Volkswagen type.
Shakespearean Doctor of Death.
Well, Shakespeare had most of these foibles. It's a little bit of...
But he wrote so well.
Well, they were writing there in Hamlet, and Hamlet, Hemlock, they're all... most of the actors don't change too much here.
I know, only the faces change a bit.
The faces change, just a bit.
Charter for healthcare workers. What does that all mean?
The Charter for Healthcare Workers is something that the Vatican put out, which is like a code of ethics. In the United States, our Catholic bishop, every single Catholic hospital and nursing care institution has what we call the ethical and religious directives. That's the Charter. That says in public, up front, what we will do and some things we will not do. And number 10 in the ethical directives is we will not assist in a suicide. We will not participate in a suicide, so we won't kill people. Now, all of that is fine, and no one ever thought that that was ever going to be challenged. But if the laws change, then our institutions are going to be under pressure because people are going to say, look, it's legal.
So
Why don't you do what's legal? And there'll be more fights. Well, you know, you get some federal support, you get some state support. Why don't you just do what the public approves? But of course, the public has not approved of this. And we should not confuse. It may sound silly, but it's more difficult. You've got to make a few distinctions where euthanasia is concerned, as against, say, abortion. No one's arguing you have to do everything, because physically you can't do everything for every person under every circumstance. And on the other hand, do nothing, that would be abandon people. Let them starve to death, you know, let them dehydrate, which is a crummy way to die without water. But it's all the cases that are in between. What's the appropriate thing to do? And the Catholic teaching, which is in accord with the medical profession and our legal system, is that we do all things that are ordinary, but no one has to do what's extraordinary. If you want to, you're free to, but you don't have to. But we can only work that out case by case by case. Because,
It's an individual basis.
well, because everyone's health situation. An example, I mean, if a 16-year-old girl has pneumonia, They treat her with sulfa drugs, antibiotics. She can be back on her feet in 4 days. It'll be a time before her dry cell batteries are where they should be. Now, if someone were 57, say, like my age, and they had cancer and renal failure and pneumonia, would you bombard him with sulfa drugs? Well, I've loaded the case. Because if you have renal failure, if your kidneys don't work and they give you sulfa drugs, that medicine will poison you. So in one case, what was very beneficial to the young lady, we'd say is ordinary. The other one was problematic because it caused more harm than good. It's not that we're changing the rules, but I mean, even if you go by your listeners, I doubt that there's 5 of them who are in the exact same health. Some things that are I mean, say you're a diabetic, well regulated on insulin. Fine, it's very beneficial to you. We'd call it in ordinary means. People who are not diabetics, you can't give them insulin, or you'll cause problems. So that's why we have to say case by case, by the facts, the clinical facts of each case. Now, good doctors, experienced doctors and nurses, they know this. And the ones with the most experience know that there are shades of differences in each case and what's the appropriate thing to do. But in no case is killing the patient good medicine. In fact, I would argue that has nothing to do with medicine. The Hippocratic Oath, and Hippocrates was like 400 years before Jesus, 400 BC. The Hippocratic Oath separated the witch doctor from the medical doctor, which was an important separation. But if the Ninth and the Second Circuit go the wrong way in Kevorkian, I don't know whether Kevorkian is, when he lost his medical license, he strikes me more as a witch doctor than a medical doctor, and that's dangerous. That's very dangerous if you're on the receiving end. I mean,
let's say that I was the devil's advocate and I negated everything you just said.
Go ahead.
Try that.
All right.
And I'm not a Catholic.
Yeah.
And I'm not even a Christian.
Right.
And I want to, and I'm suffering a great deal in pain, and I really want to die. Is the idea of wanting or the right to die a violation of a theological norm that is specific to your religion, or would it be a violation of my conscience in any way?
Since it's the stated ethics of the American Medical Association, I don't think someone should describe this as a peculiar sectarian Catholic thing. Our state task force on life and the law, back in 1994, just 2 years ago, May, put out a magnificent 207-page statement on why we should keep our laws the way they are, no assisted suicide. They did admit, candidly, that only 10% of the medical profession is really trained in pain relief. We have to improve that. We have to, because I think people are afraid of suffering. They're afraid that nothing can be done. For instance, I'm a trustee at Calvary Hospital. Calvary is a 200-bed facility in the Bronx. It's all advanced cancer. We have very simple rules there. We never do anything extraordinary. We don't do operations. We always relieve pain. We always take care of hunger and thirst. We always keep someone clean. No one ever asks to commit suicide there, because we make a promise when you come in of non-abandonment. No matter how bad this gets, whatever happens, we don't throw you out. We're going to hold your hand till the end. And people are very accepting of that. All religions. There's no religious test to get in there. The sisters, the Dominican sisters at Hawthorne in Rosary Hill, have the same philosophy and the same ethic. And if if pain relief is provided and proper care, and they're not afraid of being bounced out on the street or something, there's a proper way to handle it. And killing is no part of the medical profession.
I did an interview with Dr. Jerome Lejeune,
Oh, wonderful.
and I actually called abortion a beastly idea.
Yeah.
In euthanasia, would you say the same thing?
It's the same thing. The only thing that changed is you've moved from the womb to the ward, and the age factor has changed dramatically. But then again, you and I, and anyone who's listening, escaped the abortion tragedy, but we are all candidates, potential candidates, for euthanasia, because we're not getting any younger. And to some extent, I remember when it first came up, I was ordained in '66, and in 1967 I was assigned up in Mount Kisco. And that's the first time they started to fool around with the abortion law. And I said from the pulpit, there's really no difference between abortion and euthanasia except size.
And what year was that?
67. And 2 lawyers in the congregation came in, got me in the sacristy, said, "Oh, Father, you're shooting from the hip. You're a wild man. This is America. We beat those people in World War II. Well,
you heard that.
now we have 2 federal appeals courts. If you want irony, there were 2 sets of Nuremberg trials. 2 sets. One was the generals and the politicians. But in 1946, there was another set of trials for doctors for crimes committed against humanity. And here we are 50 years later, legalizing, almost legalizing, what 50 years ago we put doctors on trial for.
And punished.
And hanged some of them.
The American public is familiar with the expression living will, and I thought it was a great idea, of course, being not too knowledgeable until I'm doing this program and talk to you. The difference between a living will and health care?
Well, a proxy. New York State technically does not recognize the living wills. They can serve as evidence. Some other states have them. But again, the Governor's Task Force took a long, hard look at that and decided this was not wise. If I could oversimplify, a will tells you what to do, what not to do. So you write down on a piece of paper what you want done for you 5 years from tonight. You can't do it, because you don't know what will be bothering you 5 years from tonight or that. What the proxy does, instead of focusing on what, it focuses on who. You as a competent adult should make your own decisions. And if your ability becomes compromised, then you designate a proxy to make decisions for you. Obviously, you don't make an enemy your proxy, but someone who's on the same moral wavelength that you are. And I think that perfectly mimics the way the world works anyhow, because you ask the nearest of kin, you know, what do he want, what he liked, what he didn't want, what he didn't like. And I think it's much wiser, the legislation in New York State, the healthcare price. So if someone wants something like that, they should really figure out who it is that their proxy, who it is they would want to make decisions for them when they cannot make their own decisions. Because every time you admit it to a hospital or a nursing home, there's a proxy form there for you to sign if you want it. But the living will is a little bit tricky, because it mentions specific things. And just last Christmas, there was some 82-year-old lady who went into the hospital up in Albany, and she had pneumonia. And her sister came in with a living will, waving it, and said, "My sister doesn't want antibiotics. My sister doesn't want antibiotics." There was nothing the matter with her except pneumonia, and the doctors had to go to court to get a judge to vacate the living. She got the antibiotics, and 4 days later she went home. So that's why a living will is a little bit... Now, if she meant super-duper, terribly expensive antibiotics that there's only one little jar in the whole world, then I'd understand what she's talking about. But when you write down something on a piece of paper and a crisis comes, the only one they won't be asking when the crisis comes is you.
That's true.
So who interprets that? Much wiser for her to designate her sister. Well, I don't know about that particular sister.
Yeah.
Maybe she has another sister
She better get
as
a
her
legit
proxy.
one.
Because if you're going to leave a bundle, like you're going to leave a bundle to someone, maybe you wouldn't want to put that someone at the head of your proxy list.
It's called double jeopardy.
Well, it's called a vested interest.
One of the things in the newspapers and medicine that's always fascinated me, but really scared me more than even a living will, because I thought that was always a bit advanced, was brain death, or brain death.
Brain death.
And I was always worried, as a non-medical person, that can a person who is brain dead donate parts of their bodies, their organs, and still really be alive? I mean, it may not be a technical question, but it was really a question.
No, it is. But there's a problem with we're starting to trip over our own language. This didn't come up until about 1968. It first came up with the heart transplants, because your conventional way of the determination of death was heartbeat and respiration. It's like in the murder movie, they put the mirror in front of your nose to see whether you were breathing. Because 6 minutes after you stop breathing, oxygenated blood stops going to your brain. The brain is not like a muscle. It collapses, it turns to soup, and it can't be repaired. So, when they had this super-duper machinery that's doing the breathing for someone, then the question came, how valid is the traditional thing? So the so-called Harvard criteria were invented. back in 1967, 1968. And if all those tests are made, well, we make one distinction. If the brain, together with the brain stem, is dead, you're dead. There's no question about it.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to do a sequel to this program because, as I usually say, we're not running out of questions, but we're running out of times. And the question is, maybe we should do a sequel on that one subject alone, because that seems to be a very popular thing among ordinary Catholics and ordinary people. But this is Tom O'Connor, and I want to say thank you so much for being a very, very special guest.
Thank you.
And appreciate the time you spent with us.
Thank you.
And just add me to one of your many seminarians who you've taught at Dunwoody over the past years. And this is Friends of St. Maria Goretti, and I thank you so much for allowing us into your homes again. Thank you.
There was hope for Alessandro, the killer of St. Maria Goretti. There is hope for all of us if we begin now and put God first in our lives. We might ask this little saint, St. Maria Goretti, to help us, to inspire us, to live chaste and forgiving lives. I'm Father Jim Nikars for Friends of St. Maria Goretti. Thank you.
When they found her, she was almost gone. Tried to save her, but nothing could be done. She forgave him before she died. She was so young, not more than a child. The young man went to prison without any shame. In a dream he heard her calling out his name. O Virgin and Martyr, the Lord's beloved daughter,